Love him or hate him, Scott Arniel is Winnipeg's next head coach, and I thought it'd be worth talking about three different scenarios of how I see next season going with him in charge. We'll talk about all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Obviously, a lot of you are probably enjoying the Eastern and Western Conference Finals action, or maybe you're taking a bit of a break from hockey as the Jets are no longer involved in the playoffs. Obviously, this past Friday was a big one for all of us because Scott Arniel got named the next Jets head coach, and I think for a lot of us, there were mixed feelings, right? Some of us are happy, some of us are disappointed, some of us probably just don't care because there are bigger fish to fry with this team, and the coaching staff is only a part of the equation. But let's be real, right? Head coach, kind of a pretty big part of that equation, even if it's not perhaps the central question that I have with this team going forward. I think as of right now, my bigger focus is probably on the roster. But, you know, that's something that only Shoveldayoff is really going to have the ability to fix. If he can fix it, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think that we can do things to improve it, but let's be real, right? The Jets have a whole laundry list of things that they're going to have to go through. And so, whether or not Scott Arniel does well may be out of his control to some degree. But let's talk about three scenarios in just a moment, whether it's, best to worst. Before we dive into that, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Indeed. There's no I in team, but there is one Indeed, and that's the hiring platform you need to build your team. Start hiring now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Now, like I said, I've got three scenarios. I'll talk through the best first. Then I have what I think is the most likely scenario for next season. And then finally a worst case scenario, although worst case might not be the actual worst in Winnipeg's perspective because let's be honest, right? One of the things that I think the Jets kind of got shown is that, there's a lack of elite top-end, truly franchise-altering talent. And guess what? The only way that you really get that is by sucking. So we'll talk about that later in the episode. But first, let's talk about a best-case scenario, right? Everything goes super well for the Jets. They have a monster season. Now, there's actually some reason to believe that the difference between Bones and Arniel might actually be pretty marginal, right? I think where Arniel's probably going to be a little bit different than Bones is likely in talent assessments. I think Arniel, at least from the limited viewings we've had of him, had a better sense of like which kids were productive, which lines were working, and like I don't know that he, look, he was a big part of the 5v5 game. I think he had a big role in that, but I think he also differed from Rick in a couple of areas to where I'm somewhat optimistic about how he'll coach. All that said, though, I think the biggest thing with him is like, it's all going to come down to Hellebuyck, right? Hellebuyck has been our breadwinner and our main man in net, and how he goes is probably how the rest of the team is going to go. But I think this Jets team is probably going to be pretty similar to this year, where they're going to be defensively pretty resolute. I think where we're going to start to see some growing pains is probably with the youth. But assuming that all the kids really do well and carve out an NHL role, this team might be in the top three of the Central Division again, right? The defense is probably not going to change like tremendously much other than maybe Heinola moving in. You might move out one of Schmidt or Pionk, and you potentially have a bigger role for Dylan Sandberg, pending what happens with Dylan DeMello or Brendan Dillon, or even both, right? Maybe both get let go. Although I can almost guarantee that's not going to happen. One of them has to stay. I'd be shocked if both go. I can't really see either pricing themselves out of what the Jets are after. So overall, right, I think the best case scenario is that the Jets have a really deep run next year. They have another top three Central Division finish. I think they'll be in the mix for the title or for the Central Division lead, but I don't think they'll actually win the Central. I think they'll be up there, though. I think the Jets have a very solid base to work around, but it does require all of their top players really hitting their strides. Scheifele is going to need to have a stronger season. You're going to have to figure out whether Ehlers is going to be a part of this or not. If he is, well, all right, we can have a good conversation about the Jets finishing pretty high up in the division. But if he does leave and they don't really replace him with anyone in particular, obviously that'll knock back my projections a bit. I know that he hasn't always had the most prime role with this team, but I think, for next season, he could potentially be a really big part of it if he decides to stick around. But I get the sense he's probably ready to move on, which I can't really blame him. I mean, given how the Jets have used him over the years, given his frustrations with the team, it wouldn't shock me if at some point he decides to walk away. I love Ehlers, and I really wish things had worked differently. But again, wouldn't be shocked if he kind of indicates he's not resigning and the Jets decide to let him go and trade him for some defensive help, because that's probably what's going to be coming back either way. But in terms of what I see as the best case scenario, like I said, top three finish in the division. Winnipeg, has all of their young players doing really well. Everyone seems to be on the same page, and you start to have a team that looks a little more like the current Stars this year, or in many respects, the 2017-2018 Jets from a few years ago. Again, I think this is a pretty idealistic picture, and I really don't think it's all that likely. You'd also have to be honest and say that Winnipeg's defense is nowhere near either this Stars team or the Jets team of several years ago, not without a pretty big offseason of change. So this best case scenario probably needs quite a few additions to the squad, maybe some players being swapped out. Elias Salamonson could be a big addition on the back end if he really does hit it off in preseason and camp. But like I said before in previous episodes, I just don't think he's going to make the Jets this season. But I wouldn't be shocked if he gets a call up later in the year for maybe an NHL debut kind of thing. I just feel like with how the Jets have traditionally been with their defenders, it wouldn't shock me if he stays with the Moose for a year or two. But given how, much his responsibility has grown in the SHL, I also wonder if that's really the best place for him. Would it make more sense to bring him into the NHL? Because Heinel has been waiting for years for his chance to make an impact on the roster. And the one time that he finally gets it, it's A, pretty late, and B, he gets injured. So, are they going to run the gambit here and make Salamonson wait when your right side depth is actually not very good? I got to be honest, I think Salamonson would probably be an upgrade on at least one or two of our right-sided defenders just as he is, which is honestly a little scary. The fact that I can say that with even a tiny bit of confidence is a little alarming. It speaks to how bad Winnipeg's right side depth is past DeMello. So some stuff to consider, but hopefully the Jets can really nail out some of these off-season moves and hit it out of the park like they did last year. Now, I just talked through the best case scenario. I've got what I think is my most likely scenario, and then we'll talk about that, the worst case scenario towards the end of the episode. But before we talk about our most likely scenario, just wanted to talk about our friends and partners at Indeed. There's no I in team, but there is one in Indeed, and that's the hiring platform that you need to build your team. When you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites searching for candidates with the right skills, Indeed's powerful matching service gives you a whole suite of top-end candidates who match your exact needs the moment you start looking for your ideal candidate profile. And that's especially when you sponsor your job posting. They get over 80% of employers a great set of matches the moment that they do. And of course, with Indeed's instant matching service and a system where you can actually invite candidates to apply you are extremely likely to find candidates who match your exact needs. And of course, if you don't find them, guess what? You don't pay for those candidates. You only pay for candidates that match your exact job requirements. There are over 3 million businesses worldwide that already use Indeed. And as somebody who was looking for work several years ago, I can personally attest to how convenient and easy it is to use Indeed. I myself was able to complete the resume process, use all of their online tools, and it was very convenient. So if you're ready to join all of those businesses looking for great employees, start hiring now with a $75 job sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/lockedon. Offer good for a limited time. Claim your $75 credit now at Indeed.com/lockedon. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are walking through a couple of different scenarios for Winnipeg's upcoming season with Scott Arniel as head coach. Obviously, a lot of stuff is still up in the air. We don't even know who the assistants are. And to Gord's question in the comments from last episode, no, really haven't heard anything. I think we're all still sort of holding our breath with that. Brad Lauer, obviously, have some thoughts about him as special teams coach continuing on, but we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, it's been pretty quiet. Arniel was the big news dump, and so far, that's kind of been it as far as the Jets are concerned. So, stuff to keep an ie out for. We'll see if they maybe move on from a couple of the assistants. Not so clear yet. But in the meantime, obviously, the Jets have their own issues to worry about roster-wise. Before we dive into what I think could be the most likely outcome for next season, just wanted to reach out to all of you who are Fox Sports or ESPN watchers. If you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because there's so much shouting, I recommend making the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, next season I think is going to be probably a bit of a step back for the Jets, and I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. I just think Winnipeg is going to perhaps be a little more modest compared to what they were this year. I think the Jets are likely to be more of a wild card team. I think with the changes on the back end and the likely additions of more youth over some established veterans. Look, as much as I'd say that I really want the kids to play, and I think that's the best way, let's be real. There is going to be a decline between the youth and, the established veterans that you already have. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just reality. I think if you're thinking there's going to be a one-to-one handoff from Bones to Arniel with the roster likely to take some hits, let's be real, that's probably not a very realistic expectation. The Jets are going to take a step back, and I think that's probably going to put them more in like first or second wild card spot. But like I said, I don't really mind that. I think the biggest thing that I want next year is a year for growth. I've kind of thrown out the idea of this being a competitive window in the traditional sense because honestly, I think the Jets got shown that they're not actually all that prepped for the playoffs. So I wouldn't really worry about deep runs. Obviously, every year that you have Connor Hellebuck and Mark Scheifele and Kyle Connor and all these other top players, yeah, you are technically playoff competitive. But compared to like a team like Colorado or Dallas, let's be real, the Jets are a little further off in that respect, and that's where I think they kind of got a tough lesson. But that's where I think, this upcoming season is going to be really formative. This is a chance for the Jets to really grow the roster, to really develop a faster, more skilled style of hockey, and to start approaching what these teams are. I think the Jets are actually not nearly as far off as people keep saying. Obviously, a lot has to change, but I think given how the past couple of off seasons have gone, I'm more optimistic that the Jets are going to make some good moves to put this team on a better path. And I'll say one thing, right? The past trade deadline, obviously we got players who were on the slower side, but the good news is the Jets kept all of their top prospects. They only gave up a couple of modest picks and assets, which they weren't cheap, a first rounder, and a future second rounder is nothing to sniff at. But where the Jets are, right? If you're going to take a swing, getting Toffoli and Monahan with the current style of hockey that they played was probably about as good as you could possibly do. So, all that said, I think the Jets are in a pretty good spot for having a season where maybe they take a step back on the ice, but perhaps it gives the experience and skill and development that a lot of the younger players need. If you start to get those kids like Lambert and Chibrikov and Perfetti more prime roles with this team, you start to really let them grow for future seasons. I think it puts you in a much better spot longer term because their ELCs are still ongoing. Obviously, Perfetti is kind of the exception there. He's an RFA expiring this offseason that they'll need to re-up. But, for the rest of the kids, they're all just starting their pro contracts at the NHL level, really. So this is going to be a great opportunity for the Jets to kind of bring them along, get them up to NHL speed, and also supplement some of the veteran core with some younger skill, all of whom seem to be pretty good at skating, which has been one of our bigger weaknesses. I suppose the only question is, how successful are they going to be in their rookie seasons? I think for Lambert and Chibrikov, let's be real, right? We're probably looking at 25 to 30 point rookie seasons from one of them at least, which would be pretty great. I think Chibrikov is probably more in the 15 to 20 point rookie season. But that's still pretty nice for like a young kid, getting his first NHL action. I know he scored in his first game and Lambert had his first NHL assist. But let's be real, neither of them are going to be point per game players right off the bat. So I think we're going to have some growing pains. I think both are going to struggle with stuff defensively. I think you're going to see youthful mistakes from this team, and it's going to depend on what Arniel really wants the kids to do. But given the fact that he did trust Perfetti late in games, especially in third periods, over what Bones used to do, and the fact that he's also been responsible for one of the best Jets lines in history, I don't know. I think that there's some stuff there to kind of feel decent about the Jets being in the mix for a playoff spot. Like I said, I think we're talking differently now about the competitive window. I don't think it really makes sense to think about it as I did last offseason, where I'm like, all right, they've got 2 years to win a cup with this core, and that's it. I think the Jets have kind of changed their timeline a little bit by sort of accelerating more of the youth movement, and the fact that they're pushing towards that, for me, is a positive sign. I think that's the better direction. I think it makes more sense for this team, and I would be more supportive of it going forward. So, I think the most likely scenario, like I said, in the mix for a wild card, if they start to push and they manage to get around like the third spot in the Central, I don't think that's bad at all. I'm not really expecting a deep playoff run, but it would be nice if the Jets were able to get out of the first round or at least win more than one playoff game. That would be really great. Obviously, it was a bit of a humbling experience against Colorado, but I suppose it did need to happen. I think it, was a good transition point from where Bones was able to fix the culture of the team and get the Jets in a much more stable spot. And then from there, now they can start to experiment and see what the future holds for a team that's got a lot of talent and a lot of young prospects waiting in the wings, some really like special ones eventually coming down the road that could really push this team from being, middle of the pack to being perhaps a little more in the upper crust. And obviously, I'm not going to say that any of these guys are like Cale Makar or Elias Pettersson or, Miro Heiskanen level prospects. They're probably not, but I think Lambert has the ability to be a top-end player at some point. I have a lot of faith in him. I think Chibrikov's going to be a great rotational option. I think Heinola should be a nice top four defender. Hopefully he really hits his stride this upcoming season because, when I watch him with the Moose and some of the other international tournaments, he still looks really good. I don't think he's going to be like elite, but I think he's going to be pretty good. So, like I said, some reason for optimism. The Ehlers trade is going to have to be really good. I know it's probably not going to be, but if the Jets can ring out like a top four defender for the right side, I would feel a lot better about Winnipeg's upcoming season. But as it is, his loss will have a big impact and will probably be one of the reasons why the Jets are not really fighting for the top spot in the Central, but more in a wild card race. So stuff to consider, food for thought. But of course, like I mentioned earlier, I've got one more scenario, a worst case scenario, although Depending on who you ask, this may not be the worst case if it plays out well for the Jets. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some final thoughts. Like I said, we've outlined a few scenarios for the coaching staff and the Jets next season. And I think for me, the most likely scenario, middle of the pack, probably more a wild card spot, and perhaps a first round exit, but hopefully with more than one playoff win. This time, though, there's also the chance that things go really south. Maybe Hellebuyck has a down year, maybe a really critical injury sidelines somebody for the season, or maybe Arniel just really struggles to wrangle this team and get them on the same page again, and things really fall apart. Maybe Winnipeg sinks to either, just out of the wild card race, or even further if the decline is really bad, or maybe Hellebuyck gets injured or something. Assuming that something really, awful happens with this team and they start to get into like the bottom half of the NHL standings, there's a chance that may not be the worst. I know that sounds really bad, but let's be real, right? One of the things that I think has separated the Jets traditionally from a lot of other teams is that compared to all those other top franchises, look at the Jets roster. Winnipeg doesn't have many elite top end like franchise level players. They've got a lot of really good ones, and they've got one generational one in net. They've also got like a franchise level defender. But in terms of like top end forwards and stuff, Winnipeg has been a step behind teams like Colorado, Dallas, heck, even the Caps when they were in their prime. The Jets are just working more in terms of like higher end depth than higher end scoring talent. And unfortunately, in the playoffs, the higher end scoring talent is what tends to win you the war. So for the Jets, if they were to slip out of the playoffs and end up in a really bad spot, like I said, I don't think that's actually the worst. Winnipeg could potentially walk away with some top end talent in the draft, which is kind of what they've needed for a while. But by the same token, like you don't want to waste good years of Hellebuck's career. So I don't want to say that this is like a great scenario because it's really not. You want to make the most of every year that Hellebuyck is putting up Vezina caliber performances. He's probably going to win the Vezina again this year. He's been an absolute monster in net for the Jets, one of the most steadying presences in the entire NHL. And he'll probably be the reason why I think this worst case scenario does not happen. But assuming it does, I could think of worse things than the Jets being in the mix for a lottery pick. If they can get themselves like a top 10 talent this year, next season, I don't think that that's the worst. Obviously, the 2025 draft is still a ways away. I haven't been following up on prospects like a ton, so I'm not going to speak to the depth or quality of that class. But, either way, the general truth is that the worse you do, the more talent really opens up to you at the top end of the pool. So, for the Jets, maybe slipping out of the playoffs and really starting to sell some assets isn't going to be the worst thing. You've got Kyle Connor expiring soon. Ehlers obviously is probably on the way out. After that, you've got some other random pieces that you could maybe look at. Although I think for the most part, those two are probably your most valuable trade chips in the near and future terms. So for the Jets, I don't want to say that like tanking is a great thing. I can't say that I like tanking. I think it's kind of bad for the fans, and I think the Jets financially probably don't want to go that route either. If you do tank, it could end up with some really bad attendance issues, and Winnipeg was just starting to recover after a year or two of some really empty seats. But thankfully, I think the Jets are probably going to avoid this. I don't think they're going to tank at all. I think that it would take a really bad stroke of luck, and it would probably lead to more than one or two people getting fired if Winnipeg ended up at the bottom of the Central Division and really at the bottom of the NHL standings. But I don't want to rule it out either because it is entirely possible we're going to have a coach who's not really had a great track record of success prior to joining the Jets. And I do think that while he has learned a lot, and I think he's probably grown quite a bit since his first head coaching stint, anything could happen, right? Even Maurice, who was very beloved and took his team to a Western Conference Finals, ended up losing the room not that long after, and things completely fell apart at the end of his Jets tenure. So If you're the Jets, I don't know what your plan is going into next season, but hopefully we stay away from like any really toxic situations. But like I said, worst comes to worst, if you have to spin it positively somehow and you have to look for a silver lining, I suppose getting a lottery pick or a player of a similar top end calendar or caliber out at the top of the draft wouldn't be the worst outcome. I'd probably not like to do it that way. I'd prefer the Jets just be good with what they have and hopefully make some decent playoff acquisitions and stuff at the trade deadline. But, hopefully Winnipeg just puts itself on a path for a better competitive future without putting itself at the bottom of the standings. We all know what bad Jets hockey looks like, and I prefer not to go back down that route. I remember, the first time that we got Laine, I remember the day that we got the second overall pick, I yelled really loudly where I was sitting. I think I was at a Caps game, and it was a great feeling at the time, but the route to getting to Laine was not very fun at all. So I would prefer to not have to do that again. But let me know what you're rooting for next season. Are you hoping the Jets tank? Do you wish for a playoff berth? Do you think they'll really have a big drop-off next season? Or do you think they're probably going to be about as good as they were this past year? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. We will see you back here this week as obviously the offseason continues to roll. And I want to talk about, some center depth issues, how the Jets could potentially address it, maybe some suggestions on Twitter from folks who have given a number of thoughts on who they think the Jets should target down the middle. There's definitely some good trade candidates out there, but maybe not ones that I would push for the Jets to go for just yet. We'll have to see, though. The trade market is still very young. Winnipeg has just only appointed a head coach now, and from here on out, it's really about fixing the roster and choosing some assistant coaches. But like I said, for tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here this week for even more Jets coverage, so see you soon.